On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, no end in sight for the longest U.S. federal shutdown. More severe impact to come? And a top U.S. naval commander in China to defuse conflict on the high seas. A good start?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin our program today with the record-breaking government shutdown in the United States. The shutdown has already become the longest in U.S. history as it enters its fourth week. That means no pay for hundreds of thousands of government workers. The impasse is over President Trump's demand for funding a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. He threatened to declare a national emergency to get it done, but he seemed to have backed down. Or does he? For now, before we get down to the discussion with our panelists, take a look at this.
The shutdown, which affected a quarter of U.S. federal agencies, stretched into the fourth week, eclipsing all the previous 20 such closures to become the longest in the country's modern history. And until now, nobody knows when it'll end. Funding for a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border is the bone of contention. Mr. Trump backed down from a threat to declare a national emergency as an easy way out of something. Such a declaration would enable the U.S. president to bypass congressional approval and build the wall with the Pentagon's funds. Last week, he delivered a prime-time Oval Office address, visited the U.S. southern border, and met with state and local leaders at the White House, where he reiterated he had no choice.
This is very simply about doing what's right for the country. And we have to do what's right for the country. This is common sense. This is not sending rockets to the moon. This is common sense. We have to have this. The country has to have it.
Mr. Trump requested $5.7 billion for building a physical barrier along the U.S.-Mexico border, but congressional Democrats rejected his demand. The partial government shuttering began just before the Christmas holiday. Since then, the White House and the congressional Democratic leadership have held several rounds of negotiations over border security and wall funding, but all ended in failure. The Democrats called Mr. Trump's proposal a political theater and insisted the president reopen shuttered departments before negotiations continue.
We should be discussing homeland security, what's best, but not holding the government workers and so many programs hostage. We should open the government and then have our debate on the issue of homeland security.
Figures show that a quarter of the president's cabinet is filled by acting department heads. Top-level posts such as the Attorney General and the UN Ambassador are included. Some 800,000 federal workers, more than half still on the job, missed their first paychecks in 2019. Many employees took their anger to the streets, with the closure's growing impact on the economy, national parks, food inspections, and others.
We don't want to be in this tug-of-war. We want to run the safest system in the world. End the shutdown. End the shutdown.
Congress said it would guarantee that federal workers would get paid immediately after the end of the shutdown. But then, when will it be over?
So, is there an end in sight for the longest U.S. government shutdown in history? Let's turn to our three panelists. Both in Washington, D.C., we have Steve Pruitt, who is a managing partner at Watts Partners. He's also a former staff director of the Committee on Budget of the U.S. House of Representatives. Sir, good to see you in the year 2019. Meanwhile, with us in Washington, D.C., Lester Munson, principal of BGR Government Affairs. He also serves as adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins University. Good to see you as well. In Shanghai, China, we are joined by Professor Shending Li from the Institute of International Studies of Fudan University, one of the most well-known names from China on U.S.-China relations. Welcome, Professor, as well. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Pruitt, you probably is more familiar with the shutdown than most of us in Washington. It's cold winter. People are going outside and say, well, end the shutdown. But is any shutdown or the closure of it in sight?
think the short answer to that is no. I had some hope earlier that we might get through some solution this week, but I think the short answer to that's still going to be no.
Mr. Munson, though, when the government shutdown, at least the partial government shutdown continues, who is likely to bear the blame? Isn't that one of the most important questions to be asked?
Yeah, absolutely. The polling indicates President Trump is taking most of the blame, and I think that's not unreasonable. He's the one who precipitated this crisis, this budget funding crisis, this government funding crisis, right before the end of the funding. So it's largely on his shoulders. On the other hand, his demands for government programs are not at all unreasonable. Right now, both sides think it's to their advantage to act tough and not come to a compromise. I don't think that's going to stay true much longer. I think we'll see a resolution in the next few days.
In the next few days, we hope so. Professor Shen, is the U.S. government shutdown anything familiar to you, given your decades of studying U.S.-China relations?
This happens many times before, so not new. What's new is that it sets a record by this time. And this important issue of illegal immigrants does not necessarily warrant President Trump to make it a foremost issue that would cost the shutdown for historical period of time for the United federal U.S. governments. It's unnecessary.
Well, as you said many times, the shutdown, but the partial U.S. government shutdown has now become the longest in history, as all of you illustrated, gentlemen. There have been 13 shutdowns in history since 1981. The closure, which began on December the 22nd, broke a decades-old record by a 1995 to 1998 shutdown under former President Bill Clinton that lasted 21 days. So you see a chart of the days with which partial government shutdown had been in Washington, D.C. Coming to you, Mr. Pruitt. Now, it's possible that the national park is not open. It's also possible that where you are, and probably even us, coming from outside the country, who are eating exports from the United States, may not necessarily having the food that has been already approved by FDA, but what's likely to be a bigger consequence of this continuous government shutdown when it comes to national security, when it comes to some of the most crucial tasks that governments have to perform?
Well, I think the biggest concern that is being aired right now has to do with the ability of Americans and others to fly in the United States and the impact that that is going to have in terms of air safety, in terms of air security. That is a big one. I think the other issue, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about more, is the economic impact. Obviously, when you talk about records in 2013, during the, I believe it was 16-day shutdown during President Obama's term, the cost of that shutdown was estimated to be $25 billion. This one, now that we're at 21 days and counting, 22 today, certainly will exceed that number as well, which far exceeds what the President is asking for in terms of money. I think ultimately all the rest of government that is opening on a regular basis is concerned about what about me next, because there are several other sort of junction points, even if we do reach a solution today that maybe provides short-term opening relief. I think the issue of the wall is going to continue on because the President needs that, he believes, for his re-election.
All right. Well, is there any possibility for compromise, Mr. Munson, in sight? A plan for the White House and also the Democrats that are now the majority in the House?
Well, we're really talking about very modest figures. The President talks about $5.5 billion for the wall. The Democrats have already shown they're willing to spend about $1.5 billion on the wall. Numbers have been floated of $2.5 or $3 billion as a compromise figure. all of those numbers are very modest relative to the size of the U.S. government. All it takes is for Senator Schumer, Speaker Pelosi, and President Trump to actually be willing to compromise and take the heat from their base for not giving them everything that they want, and then they'll have an agreement. It's not a ton of money. It's basically $1 billion or $1.5 billion.
It's not just $1.5 billion. I'm afraid, Mr. Munson, you know better than I do. Mr. Pruitt, for example, it is about 2020. It's not just about a few billion, is it?
No, it's not a $1 or $2 billion issue here. It may be in terms of counting nickels and dimes, but it's we're talking real dollars here and real political impact. And I think it's going to be difficult to come up with a construct that, as Lester did say, that satisfies both sides. But I think there are some possibilities out there. I know in 1986, when I was on the Budget Committee, we came up with a construct that settled and in fact, avoided more than about a 6-hour shutdown with President Reagan at that time. And there's, I think, a call right now from many corners to see how creative we can become and see if, instead of simple brick and mortar thinking, we can move the president to start looking at the outcome here more as a solution than a problem.
When you say we, who do you mean?
I'm talking on behalf of all Americans. We're sick of this. It makes no sense at all for our government to be closed, for our food safety to be compromised, for our ability to fly to be limited, and I can go on and on and on. But when you start looking at things like our embassies not being open and functioning around the world, when you look at our Commerce Department and the role that it plays in terms of other international trade that impacts our economy, the impacts here are fairly significant, and they're really starting to ring home, not only with individuals and federal workers in particular, but certainly with business interests around the world.
Mr. Munson, the president is well known for changing his mind. Well, of course, he's also well known at the same time for sticking to some of the points he is supposed to believe. But Mr. Munson, this seems to be a president that tried to make sure the wall will become a signature issue for him, particularly leading up to 2020, and particularly in his early fight against the House Democrats. So will he be more flexible, as Mr. Pruitt earlier wished?
Well, who knows? I think the most important thing for the president is that he appear to be fighting for the wall every single day. So even if we do get to a compromise where there's a agreed upon amount of funding for the wall, I fully expect that the next day President Trump will say, that's not enough, we need more, and precipitate a crisis down the road. So really the reality of the wall on the border is less important for the president than the appearance that he is fighting for the wall. It is a huge symbol of his presidency.
Right. Professor Shen, well knowing what these two other gentlemen has articulated for us, Professor Shen, you know, there are a lot of things going on between China and the United States that really needs to have a day-to-day attention, if not more than that. For example, the trade negotiation, and also some of the specific discussions between the two governments that would help the two countries to re-streamline the priorities in order to avoid a new Cold War, as they say. Professor Shen, from China's perspective, or as a Chinese scholar, are you worried?
Of course, China-U.S. need to talk, but the problem is that Trump has not found those hundreds of leader he should fill in the post at the bureau level of various federal governments. By this budget crisis, 1/4 of the federal staff are off the work without a pay. These people have pain. Without a pay, how they can sustain their family? And without their implementing their duty on their post, how Chinese could fund their counterparts when we need to talk? The U.S. president would not go to Davos. It's a loss of the U.S. and the entire world. We need the U.S. leader to be there to listen to the world and to present a U.S. view. And of course, he can delegate his deputy. But that has already hurt the U.S. engagement of the world. So this ongoing, endless kind of gloomy uncertainty absolutely harms the U.S. conduct of the foreign policy and its implementing of its government affairs, and hurting China-U.S. relationship, because we may not find the right person to be able to sit on the U.S. side of the table.
Well, Mr. Munson, for a president who claims America first, is what Professor Chen just said relevant?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in what he says. You know, this crisis is impacting the image of the U.S. in the world. It makes our government look like it's incompetent, even though there are some deep-seated political issues that are being battled out through this process. It doesn't look good to Americans. It doesn't look good to people outside the U.S. I agree that it's going to impact U.S. national security. On the other hand, I think we don't want to overstate it. The U.S. It remains engaged in the world. The Defense Department is fully funded. The U.S. continues to engage in national security activities around the globe. None of those are really at risk at the moment. I think if this shutdown does carry on for several more weeks, then there will be some more serious issues. But right now, I think let's not make too much out of it. But it really doesn't look good for the U.S. government abroad. I think it's more damage to the image than anything.
Is it more about the image, Mr. Pruitt?
I do. I think it's more about the image. The U.S. just doesn't look like it knows how to run its own government. Our political process looks sclerotic. Again, the real issues being discussed between American politicians, and the American people are genuinely divided on these issues, so they have to hash it out somehow, but it doesn't look very good.
Mr. Pruitt?
Well, I think the image of the United States is well ingrained right now. It doesn't take that long to build a viewpoint, and I think our world leaders, thanks to 24/7 news coverage, have had more than enough opportunity to judge both current U.S. politics and our current president. What is harmful, I believe, though, is that this episode of what's up in Trump world is going to be real problematic going forward, because it suggests a real change in the script, that he will indeed be much more confrontational than folks thought he needs to be. And secondly, even though there's been a partial change of control in the Congress, it really doesn't bode well, I believe, over the longer term on some of our larger international issues, like U.S.-China trade. I suspect going into this, there's been questions asked repeatedly about what is the U.S. government's goals and objectives here. Those have still not been detailed. We're not seeing any indication that that's coming out of the current talks.
Right.
And as we move forward, any developments that occur still have to go back before Congress. And if we poison the water now, nobody's going to drink it in the future.
Mr. Munson, though, as Mr. Pruitt put it earlier, that this president apparently is trying to showcase his stubbornness and also his confrontational style after the midterm election to the other party through this temporary shutdown of the government. One would earlier assume that he might be likely less confrontational because of the divide of the government now, but he only take the very first opportunity to do exactly the opposite. Now, will the Democrats, knowing the leadership style of that party and also some of the key persons now in the leadership, do you think it is likely to back down, or further confrontational style will be developed even from the other side, from the other party?
Well, I think, look, for the last 2 years, President Trump has really only had Republicans to push against. Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate, and and Democrats were just not that big of a factor in Washington politics, so the fight ended up being between Trump and other Republicans, and Trump very much needs a fight to be relevant every day. Now he's got Democrats in Congress, but particularly in the House with Speaker Pelosi, that he can push back against, and I think he wants to test that confrontation and see how well he can do. And the Democrats are matching him. They're being as intransigent as he is because that plays better for their base. This is a big contest of wills. It's really not about the merits of the issue per se. It's about who's going to get the upper hand in political Washington. And I totally agree with Mr. Pruitt. This is an episode of what's up in Trump world. It's a silly exercise at the end of the day. It doesn't have much to do with serious government. We're not discussing the big issues that impact the United States and our people. So really, it's in some respects a waste of time. It probably makes for very good television, and the ratings are very high. It's a reality show, but it's not what government is for, and it's not a serious attempt to govern this country.
You better learn, Professor Shen, to work with the reality show star every day, even from a China's perspective. So what can we learn from this story that's already analyzed by the other two gentlemen?
Well, regretfully, we see the confrontation of the Congress and the President, and between the two parties. U.S. claims it is a government of the people, and meticulously has designed a system with three governments. But fundamentally, they should partner together to work together. They could have difference, but they should be able to negotiate, to compromise for nation's benefits. But increasingly, we see that the U.S. is unable to properly represent, the government cannot properly represent the people. And this has vividly illustrated such negative trends. So people would question how the design, the forefathers of the U.S. had designed a system that seemed to be degenerating. Wow. That caused many people to question the validity of the assumption of U.S. Political institution.
Well, first of all, for the other two gentlemen, probably you have to understand that Professor Shen has been studying the American system, helping Chinese to understand the American system for decades. So I guess it's a legitimate question for him to raise issues related to the system to both of you, first of all. Secondly, to elites like you, do you think there are solutions that some of the backbones like you guys will be able to play a bigger role despite the apparent paralysis of the government, at least partially, so far? How will they function punctually, and how will they function effectively? Mr. Pruitt and Mr. Munson, 30 seconds for both of you, sir. Thank you so much. And Mr. Pruitt, your solution?
Well, the short answer from my perspective is they've got to come up with something that is creative, that both addresses the concern as well as leaves folks options that they can still work with.
Like what?
I've been suggesting to Democratic friends and contacts to leadership to look at history. Go back to 1986, go back to 1992, when there was discussions about a so-called lockbox approach to dealing with some of our spending problems, where you provide access to funding based on a certain set of criteria that have to be met. And once those criteria are met, then the funds could be spent. And I think the President provided a great opportunity by pointing out, when he tried to defend that they've already spent money, that they weren't paying the contractors until they had completed their work. So,
Mr. Munson, you have better option?
Well, I think Senator Lindsey Graham's come up with a compromise. He said, let's open the government, let's continue to negotiate on the wall, and if we don't come to a deal in 3 weeks, the President can declare an emergency and get some funding for his wall. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me at all. Let me just point out, per the professor's point, that the U.S. government is not designed to be an efficient executor of policy. What it's designed to be is a forum where the American people's views and interests are mediated, and that's what's going on. This is democracy at work. It can be very ugly, and it can look a little incoherent at times, but this is what democracy is like. The American people are struggling with these issues. Therefore, their representatives are struggling with them. There's a deep divide in the country over a bunch of things, and this is how we work it out. We work it out in public, in the open, on television.
I guess we will leave it open also here with this debate and discussion. We'll see when things will be resolved and in what way. That will be a very interesting episode to come. Thank you so much for now, the three gentlemen, for joining us, coming from your different perspective. Steve Pruitt, Lester Munson, Shunding Lee. Really appreciate it. Thank you.